before this video begins, I just want to thank everybody for the tremendous growth for my channel. Amazing support by all of you guys commenting, just like and subscribe. And I can't wait to see from where it goes from here. The story I'm about to show you is a terrifying true story that happened in a basement. You always get like haunted things going on. Phantoms always appear at basement, evil dead cults. And I still remember when seeing my house for the first time. I was a child of 7. My young parents had just bought their first home. I remember I used to hate living in the cramped, diggingly apartment we previously inhabited, and opened the door to our new home with a wide-eyed wonder. It blew my young mind how spacious, cold this house was. I went upstairs to scoop it out of my bedroom. I was so excited. I was getting my own room and did not have to share it with my infant brother. On my grand tour out my new digs, I finally made it down to our basement. The basement was nothing like the rest of the room. The upstairs was elegant and classy. The basement was quite cold and metallic and sterile. To be honest, the ceiling covered in ancient pipe window and grass-stack angles. The floor covered in very tough cement. I recalled taking a look at the stairs for the first time and had been immediately struck with how odd they were. The stairs were surrounded in drywall, which clashed with the rest of the basement. One particular section of the wall was colored differently than the rest. It stuck like a sore thumb. I inched close to it and I felt the texture of it. It felt very strange. I then knocked on it. A hollow sound pervaded the empty air of the basement. Something about the sound immediately pulled me ill at ease. I walked up the stairs as I could hear the same hollow sound echoing in the emptiness of the basement. As we settled into our new house, I began to get comfortable with my surroundings. The house began to feel familiar, everything just like usual. That is, except for the basement, and I only been there for once. It just always put me off and avoided going down there as the best as I could. Our family couldn't be happier. My loving father and mother doted over me and my little brother. Overall, my life was perfect. I could hear errant noises when I pointed out to my parents. They told me the old standby the houses was settled in one night and particularly indicated that something wasn't right. I snuck downstairs to the kitchen for the late night snack. As I closed the refrigerator, I heard the tapping noise that cut through the silence of the night. I craned my head and to see if I could pinpoint where the sound was coming from. Dread began to wash over me, and I realized that the tapping was coming from the basement. I inched my way down the basement door. I opened it to see the blackness of the depth below. My ears started to perk up. There it was again, that hollow tapping sound, the same sound I have heard on my initial visit to the basement from hitting the drywall. I turned on the light steeling myself to go down the stairs and investigate. The tapping continued as I took the first step. Fear overtook me, so I decided to run back to my room and hide under my covers until the morning lights gave way back to a normal life. I still remember walking down the stairs, being the first one up and about. I ran to the living room to play a Nintendo game. On my way, I passed the door to the basement. It was shut, though I was in the state of a near panic when I ran from it the previous night. I distinctly remember leaving the door open and not turning off the lights. I rationalized that my mother or father must have gone down there for some reason and I lost myself in a Super Mario Bros. 3. Later that night, I mentioned that incident to my parents and they just assured me that what I heard was the sound of the hot water heater clicking into the night and knew better. But what come the illogical explanation about a month after the move. My mother once asked me to run downstairs and grab a load of socks as our washer and dryer were in the basement. So I reluctantly told her I would. It was the middle of the day and enough time had passed to duel the fear I had felt a week prior. I turned on the lights and then ran downstairs, hearing the hollow sound echoing from my footsteps. A cold sweat started to, form on me. It's the back chilling. And I made my way to the dryer and grabbed the basket. I pulled the socks on hastily and shoved them into the basket. After I shut the door to the dryer, I surveyed my surroundings. The stillness of the basement was so eerie. Then I heard it, a faintly audible whisper. Hey. At first, I thought it was somebody calling me from upstairs, and their voice scarcely making it down into the basement. However, it wasn't not the case. The sound was coming from the basement, specifically from under the stairs. As I stood frozen with fear, it began to increase in volume, but still remaining barely above the threshold of a human perception. What was being said incomprehensible to my young ears. Then it stopped as quickly as it began. I moved it towards the stairs, keeping my eye on the oddly colored portion of the dryer wall as I took my first step to escape the ever-growing nightmare. The most profoundly terrifying moment of my life occurred. A loud, hollow bang shook the stairs, almost knocking me to the ground. I ran up the stairs as fast as my legs would carry me. Though, through the fears and shaking uncontrollably, I told my parents what happened last night. They tried their best to calm me down, but nothing they said would really ease my mind. So I told them in uncertain terms that I would never go down their basement again. They must have been convinced of how terrified I was, because they honored my request and never sent me down. After another three or couple miles later in the house, things turned to normalcy for me. And honestly, this was about a 2-week period where I was happy again. The last time happiness would exist in my life or my family's for that matter. One moment in particularly comes to mind. I remember lifting up a little Jonathan above my head lovingly as he pacifier fell out of his mouth and brushed again at my nose, tickling me. I pulled him in for a big bear hug, like an embrace, and remember how he smiled, that wonderful smile that babies emitted, and for the last time, feeling content. Any semblance of a contentment came crushing down for me and my parents in a couple days later. That is the day Jonathan went missing. A random note was cracked and barely legible English and I left in his bed demanding $20,000 cash. I informed my parents that if they contacted the police, they would kill Jonathan immediately. My mother and father took to their room and argued loudly and emotionally over whether or not calling the police or yes. As I listened with a fear, like tears and screaming down my eyes, my mother eventually wrote down my father, and the police were called, seeing as the location of the drop and the time were indicated on the notes. The police set up a wiretap, just in case the kidnapper decided to call. And then I asked my parents and the police if they thoroughly searched through the house in case if he was still there. He assured me that he had and that Jonathan would be fine after the drop, but the seeds of an idea were already growing in my mind that would bloom throughout the rest of my life. My parents followed the instruction to a T spot. They dropped off the money and then waited in the location where they were supposed to pick up Jonathan. He never came. Needlessly to say, it tore my family apart. As the week passed, there was no news about Jonathan. My young, vibrant parents became husks of their formal selves. My mother especially blamed herself for getting the police involved and believed that to be the reason Jonathan was not returned. One night, as she was sobbing alone in a shambles, clutching a bottle of wine, I finally decided to divulge to her and my theory that had been brewing inside my school. I told her that I thought it was something, however, was under the stairs that had gotten Jonathan and maybe it is still alive. She then slapped me across my face so hard that I saw stars. She screaming at me, the guilt's expression that came from him itself as a rage. She told me to stop the childish bullshit and just accept the truth that Jonathan was taken out of the house by some random psychopath and is dead. My childhood dead that day. I remember contemplating taking a hammer and exposing whatever was under the stairs myself. But the fear was just too overwhelmed for me to actually do it, let alone step one stair down into the basement. My family moved shortly after the incident. I remember looking to the future with what might resemble optimism, only to have it come crashing down. My parents divorced. The grief was too much to share, and not a year after that my mother killed herself. The guilt must have just overwhelmed her. My father did his best to raise me, but Jonathan's this long shadow will always haunt over our lives. 20 years later, I began to think alone and hard about my little brother's disappearance and how angry it made me. It touches me. My family had a chance at a normal and fulfilling life. It was snuffed out in an instant by whoever took him. I wasn't just robbed of a little brother. I was robbed of any chance of happiness. As I grew up, I accepted the official story of what happened, but lately, curiosity began to get the better of me. I began driving past the old house, or also known as the haunted house, unbounded, and seeing that it was currently vacant. Ideas began to swirl in my head, so I broke into the house, bolstered by the alcohol. I decided to do it, knowing I would likely find nothing under the basement stairs, but hoping that this would close a too long chapter in my life and allowed me to finally move on. To my dismay, the stairs sounded exactly the same as I remembered they did. A hollow sound pervading the emptiness of the basement. I stared at the spots in the dry wall, still discolored, still just as ominous as it was when I was a child. However, fear was not going to stop me. In fact, I was feeling the opposite. I was feeling the courage I hadn't felt in a long time. The moment of truth was upon me, with all the force within me, emboldened by years of pent-up rage. I ran towards the wall shoulder first. The draw wall came crashing down around me. I opened my eyes as my bravery was immediately eroded and turned into the absolute horror. Oh my lord! Bones bones everywhere. My horror increased to an unimaginable height as I surveyed the tight space, seeing the myriad skeletons strewn about, the lights playing menacingly on their tiny frames. Tattered pieces of paper were strewn about with God only knows what written on them. They must have been the remains of 20 to 30 children, and then my fright reaching a crescendo when I realized that was no exception, that they were all missing their skulls. One particularly tiny one begged for my attention. I began waking the knees and I fell backwards when I saw what were unmistakably bite marks up and down the tiny forearm. As I hit the ground, I expected to hear a dull thud as I landed on the concrete. Instead, I heard a hollow sound. I looked to see what I had landed on, a trapdoor, finding new courage, summoning the strength I didn't even know I had it. I opened it. Below me lay a dark tunnel, a crawl space that could barely fit a person lying on their stomach. The dank smell incredibly wafting upwards made me reluctant, but I knew what I had done to do. Before I was unconscious, I was conscious of what my muscles were doing. I found myself crawling through the darkness towards whatever lay on the other side. As I reached the end of the tunnel, I looked up to see a silver of a light cutting through the darknesses with trepidation. I pushed it upwards. Cautiously, I poked my head up. To my surprise, the tunnel had led to the other side of the stairs. I crawled out to find myself in a corner of the basement, facing the stairs behind a dryer covered in years of dust. The implications of all of this sent my mind reeling. But before I could form a coherent thought, the lights turned off, all of a sudden in the basement. My heart suddenly dropped, like a stone, caught in my throat as I began to hear someone descending the stairs. Slow but sure, steps announcing I was no longer alone. With every thought, my heart skipped a beat. Heartbeats start raising up. I began to hear that incomprehensible whispering, absolutely indelible in my mind. The familiarity of reigniting the fear that woe and the woe of the lost childhood, worrying the darkness that would not adequately hide me away. I sought cover by ducking behind the dryer, not willing to take the risk of catching a glimpse through every fiber of my being screamed to do so. Panic began to set in. What am I going to do when discovers his lair has been revealed? While I was mulling over my options, the screaming began. Ah! I say a scream as a frame of a reference, but there is no way to truly, describe the guttural noises as I heard. The sounds smashing the silence of the basement were so bone-chilling, so surreal, so radical as they defy description. He clearly had discovered his perverse sanctuary had been disturbed. Before I knew it, I was up the stairs, running for my life. With my muscles working incoherent, I opened the door and I put the key in the ignition, and once with the movement, as my car spun to life under the street lights, a shadow fell over my car. I gunned it, never looked at me back. Flooring the accelerator to the local police precinct, I breathlessly tried to explain to the attending officer what had occurred, and I collapsed to the floor in mid-sentence. Now, it is a month later. The next day, after my discovery, the police launched an investigation and quickly made the same gruesome discovery. I was thankfully, profusely by the police and the community for what I had fun telling me what were going to be able to close the books on multiple missing person cases. However, they were not able to find the perpetrator of these heinous crimes. They began to test the DNA of the bodies. A profound sense of relief overcame me when I received a call informing me that one of the tiny skeletons belonged to Jonathan. And then I shared the news with my father. The look on his face relieved all encompassing as the burden he had carried for so many years was lifted. We hugged as the tears that filled the both of from our eyes. However, the relief has been short-lived. The thing that keeps me up at night is that whoever, how or whatever did, this is still out there. The question that plagues my mind is whether or not this monster's literal or figurative. Either the both ways, I hope I never find out. Thank you for you guys patiently listening to my show. Please subscribe to my channel, also to comment it as you wish. I'll be respond immediately as you post it, and I will see you guys in my next interesting episode.